She wasn't sick. Her husband knew it, her children knew it, and the doctor who signed the paper knew it too. But in Canada, in 1903, that didn't matter, because a husband didn't need a reason, he needed a signature. One doctor, one magistrate, and a woman who had done nothing wrong could be removed from her home, placed behind locked doors, and classified, legally, officially, permanently, as insane. Her name was Louisa Doyle. She was 31 years old. She had 3 children. And the reason she was committed to the Ontario Hospital for the Insane at Brockville was not a psychiatric condition. It was a disputed inheritance. Remember that name. Remember that reason. Because by the time this story is finished, you will understand that Louisa Doyle was not an exception to the system. She was the system working exactly as designed. To understand the ticket system, you have to understand what a Canadian asylum actually was in the late 19th and early 20th century. It was not a hospital in any meaningful clinical sense. It was a legal destination, a place that the law created, the government funded, and society used, not primarily to treat mental illness, but to remove people who were inconvenient, difficult, poor, or simply in someone else's way. The buildings were impressive. Enormous Victorian institutions set on large grounds, often in picturesque locations outside city centers. They had farms, workshops, chapels. They looked, from the outside, like places where something purposeful was happening. What was happening inside was something different. Something that the people running them understood and the public was not meant to examine too closely. And at the center of it was a piece of paper, a form, a process so simple, so deliberately uncomplicated, that it could take a person from ordinary life to locked ward in less than 48 hours. They called it the commitment process. The people it consumed called it something else. They called it the ticket. The commitment process in most Canadian provinces in the late 19th and early 20th century required 3 things: a medical certificate, signed by one physician, sometimes 2, stating that the person in question was of unsound mind and a danger to themselves or others; a magistrate's order, a judicial authorization that converted the medical opinion into a legal instrument; and a physical transport, the actual removal of the person from wherever they were to the nearest provincial asylum. The entire process, from first signature to locked door, could be completed in under 48 hours. There was no requirement that the person being committed be present at the hearing, no requirement that they be informed of the proceedings against them, no requirement that they have legal representation, no requirement that the medical certificate be based on an actual examination. In documented cases, physicians signed commitment papers for people they had never met, based on descriptions provided by the person requesting the commitment. And here is the detail that makes the ticket system something more than bureaucratic negligence. The people most frequently requesting commitments were not strangers. They were husbands, fathers, brothers, adult children seeking control of an elderly parent's estate, employers seeking to silence a troublesome worker, business partners seeking to remove a competitor. The asylum was available to anyone who could get a doctor to sign a paper. And in an era when medicine was a profession dominated by men, when women had no legal standing to challenge their commitments, when the poor had no access to legal representation, getting a doctor to sign was rarely the obstacle it should have been. The records of Canadian asylums from the late 19th and early 20th century, the intake logs, the case files, the admission registers, tell a story that the institutions themselves never intended to be read this way. Women committed by husbands for moral insanity, a diagnosis that could mean anything from adultery to simply arguing too much. Women committed after miscarriages, after the death of a child, after expressing grief in ways that made the men around them uncomfortable. Women committed for refusing to perform domestic duties, for being, in the language of the era, difficult. Immigrants committed because they didn't speak English well enough to communicate with the examining physician. Indigenous people committed under circumstances that bore a disturbing resemblance to the residential school transfers happening simultaneously, removed from communities, placed in institutions, classified as mentally deficient by a system that had no framework for understanding anything outside its own cultural assumptions. Poor people committed because poverty produced conditions, malnutrition, untreated illness, desperation, that the medical establishment of the time classified as symptoms of mental disorder rather than consequences of material deprivation. And occasionally, documented, named, specific cases, people committed by family members who wanted their money, their property, or simply to be rid of them. The asylum accepted all of them. The ticket system made no distinction between the genuinely ill and the deliberately imprisoned. That was not a flaw in the design. It was the design. Once the ticket was issued and the doors closed behind you, the path back out was not the reverse of the path in. Getting committed required one doctor and one magistrate. Getting released required the superintendent of the asylum to certify that you had recovered, that you were no longer of unsound mind, no longer a danger, and the superintendent's judgment was essentially final. There was no appeal mechanism available to ordinary patients, no independent review, no legal process by which a person inside the asylum could challenge the superintendent's assessment of their mental state. The structural problem was obvious and was noted by critics at the time. A person who insisted they were sane, who protested their commitment, who demanded to be released, who argued that the system had made an error, was demonstrating by the institutional logic of the asylum the very symptoms that justified keeping them there: agitation, delusion, lack of insight into their condition. The sane person and the genuinely ill person behaved the same way inside the asylum. Both protested, both insisted they didn't belong there, and the institution had no reliable mechanism for distinguishing between them, because the institution was not designed to make that distinction. It was designed to contain. Stay with me, because what comes next is the part that the official histories of Canadian psychiatry have spent a century trying to minimize. The treatments applied to patients in Canadian asylums under the ticket system era were not designed to cure. They were designed to manage. Hydrotherapy, cold, wet sheet wraps, prolonged baths, high-pressure hoses was standard, not because evidence supported its effectiveness, but because it was controllable. It kept patients occupied. It gave the staff something to do that looked like treatment. Physical restraint was routine. Patients who were agitated, patients who were in many documented cases simply frightened and protesting their confinement, were placed in mechanical restraints that prevented movement, straitjackets, wrist and ankle cuffs, isolation rooms with padded walls, and the medication. In the early asylum era, the primary pharmaceutical tool was chloral hydrate, a sedative that produced sleep and reduced agitation. It did not treat anything. It silenced. It made the wards manageable. It made the patients easier to count, easier to feed, easier to ignore. A person committed to a Canadian asylum in 1900 who was not mentally ill when they arrived had a significant probability of developing genuine psychiatric symptoms within months, not because of any inherent vulnerability, but because the conditions of confinement, the isolation, the loss of autonomy, the constant exposure to genuinely disturbed patients, the treatments applied regardless of need, produced them. The asylum, in documented cases, created the illness it was supposed to treat. Louisa Doyle was committed to the Brockville Asylum in 1903 following a dispute over property that her husband believed she was entitled to under her father's will. The commitment papers described her as suffering from moral insanity, a diagnosis so broad that it was essentially meaningless as a clinical category, and so useful that it appeared on asylum intake forms across Canada for decades. The examining physician had met her once. The meeting lasted approximately 20 minutes. Inside Brockville, Louisa was placed in a general ward. She wrote letters to her children, to her lawyer, to the provincial government. Some of the letters were delivered. Many were not, intercepted by asylum staff who had broad discretion over patient correspondence. She requested legal assistance. The requests were noted in her file and not acted upon. She remained in Brockville for 4 years. She was released in 1907, not because anyone in authority concluded she had been wrongfully committed, but because the property dispute that had motivated her commitment was finally resolved, and her husband no longer had a financial reason to keep her there. She returned home to children who were 4 years older, to a life that had been conducted without her, to a community that knew she had been in the asylum and treated that knowledge the way communities of that era treated such knowledge, as evidence of something shameful, even if the shame was not hers. She never spoke publicly about what had happened to her. The record of her case exists only because a family member preserved her letters. There is no monument to Louisa Doyle. There is no street named after her. There is a file in a provincial archive that most people will never read. Louisa Doyle was not alone. Between 1880 and 1940, the population of Canadian asylums grew from approximately 3,000 patients to over 67,000. The growth was not primarily driven by an increase in mental illness in the population. It was driven by an expansion of the commitment criteria, an increase in the number of institutions, and a broadening of the social categories that the asylum was used to manage. Historians who have examined asylum intake records from this period have identified consistent patterns. Women were committed at significantly higher rates than men for conditions that, in men, were not considered grounds for commitment. Immigrants were committed at higher rates than Canadian-born citizens. Indigenous people were committed at rates disproportionate to their share of the population. The asylum population tracked, with remarkable consistency, the social hierarchies of Canadian society. The people at the bottom of those hierarchies, the people with the least power to challenge a commitment, the least access to legal representation, the least ability to navigate a system conducted entirely in the language of their oppressors, were the people most likely to receive the ticket. This was not coincidence, it was consequence. The ticket system did not create inequality, it administered it. Canadian provinces did have a nominal oversight mechanism for their asylum systems, the Inspector of Asylums, a government official charged with reviewing conditions in provincial institutions and reporting to the legislature. The inspector system was, in practice, ineffective at preventing wrongful commitments. Inspectors visited institutions, they reviewed records, they spoke to superintendents. They rarely spoke to patients, and when they did so in the presence of staff, under conditions that made honest communication essentially impossible. The inspectors' reports from the late 19th and early 20th century are a remarkable historical record, remarkable for what they do not say as much as for what they do. Overcrowding was noted and attributed to insufficient facilities rather than inappropriate admissions. Deaths were recorded without investigation into their causes. Patient complaints were mentioned briefly and dismissed as symptoms of the very conditions that justified confinement. The oversight system was designed to produce reports that satisfied the legislature, not to protect the people inside the institutions, and it fulfilled that design with consistent efficiency for decades. Up until this point, you might think this was simply a system that failed to prevent abuse. It wasn't. The next part changes that entirely. By the 1920s, a small but persistent reform movement was emerging in Canadian psychiatry. It was driven partly by clinicians who were genuinely troubled by what they saw inside the asylums, by the gap between the therapeutic language used to justify the institutions and the custodial reality of what happened inside them. And it was driven partly by journalists and reformers who had begun, cautiously, to examine the commitment process and publish what they found. The most significant early Canadian voice in asylum reform was Clarence Hinks, a psychiatrist who co-founded the Canadian National Committee for Mental Hygiene in 1918 and spent decades advocating for improvements in the treatment of the mentally ill. Hinks's advocacy was genuine, but it was also limited in a specific way that reflects the era. He wanted better treatment for the genuinely mentally ill. He was less focused on the question of who was being committed in the first place, on the structural features of the ticket system that made wrongful commitment not just possible but routine. Reform came slowly, commitment criteria were gradually tightened, legal representation for those facing commitment became, eventually, a right rather than a rarity. Independent review mechanisms were introduced, but the changes were incremental, and while they were happening, the institutions continued to operate. The people inside them continued to be there, and the damage that had already been done to Louisa Doyle, to the tens of thousands of others who had passed through the system, was not undone by the reforms that came afterward. Not everyone who went in came out. The mortality rate in Canadian asylums in the late 19th and early 20th century was significantly higher than in the general population, even accounting for the fact that some patients entered the institutions already seriously ill. Deaths from tuberculosis, which spread rapidly in overcrowded institutional settings with poor ventilation, were common. Deaths from malnutrition in institutions where food budgets were chronically underfunded. Deaths from physical restraint, documented cases of patients dying while in mechanical restraints from positional asphyxia or cardiac events that staff did not recognize or respond to in time, and deaths that were recorded simply as cause unknown, a category that appears with uncomfortable frequency in asylum death registers from this period, in numbers that suggest either catastrophic diagnostic incompetence or a deliberate policy of not looking too closely at how patients died. The people who died in these institutions were buried in asylum cemeteries, on institutional grounds, in graves that were often marked only with numbers. The families of patients who died inside were not always notified. The records of who was buried where were not always maintained with the care that the task required. Some of those graves have been found. The work of finding and identifying them is ongoing. Many remain unmarked. One of the most effective tools the asylum system had for concealing what it was doing was language. The commitments were not imprisonments, they were admissions. The patients were not prisoners, they were residents. The restraints were not punishments, they were therapeutic interventions. The deaths were not institutional failures, they were natural outcomes of pre-existing conditions. Every aspect of the asylum's operation was wrapped in the vocabulary of medicine and care. And that vocabulary was extraordinarily effective at preventing the public, the legislature, and the legal system from seeing what was actually happening. When a journalist wrote that a woman had been imprisoned in an asylum without cause, the asylum's response was not to address the substance of the allegation, it was to note that the institution was a hospital, not a prison, that the woman was a patient, not a prisoner, and that the journalist's characterization reflected a misunderstanding of the therapeutic mission of the institution. The language made accountability almost impossible, because the language defined the terms of the debate, and the terms of the debate as the asylum defined them excluded the possibility that the institution was doing anything other than providing care. The ticket system, in its original form, was gradually dismantled over the course of the 20th century. The worst institutional practices, the mechanical restraints, the unmodified electroconvulsive therapy, the routine use of sedation as a management tool, were reformed or prohibited. The asylum population of Canada peaked in the 1960s and declined sharply through deinstitutionalization in the 1970s and 1980s. The institutions that had held tens of thousands of people were emptied. Many of the buildings were closed. But here is the question that the official history of Canadian psychiatry has never fully answered. Of the tens of thousands of people who passed through the asylum system under the ticket era, how many of them should not have been there? How many were committed not because they were mentally ill, but because they were inconvenient? How many were women whose husbands wanted them gone, immigrants whose families couldn't navigate the system, poor people whose poverty was misread as pathology? The records exist. They are in provincial archives. They have been examined by historians, and the answer, based on the available evidence, is a significant number. A number large enough that wrongful commitment was not an aberration in the Canadian asylum system. It was a feature. Louisa Doyle came home in 1907. She lived until 1931. She raised her children. She did not speak publicly about the 4 years she had lost. The community around her moved on. The asylum at Brockville continued to operate for decades after her release, admitting, treating, discharging, and sometimes burying the people the ticket system delivered to its doors. The building still stands. It is a heritage site now. It appears on historical walking tours of Brockville. The brochure describes it as a pioneering institution in the history of Canadian mental health care. It does not mention Louisa Doyle. It does not mention the commitment papers signed by a doctor who met her once for 20 minutes. It does not mention the letters she wrote that were never delivered. It does not mention the 4 years. What it has been less good at is preserving the memory of what those institutions actually did. to specific people, with specific names, who deserved better than what they got and never received an acknowledgement that they had been wronged. Louisa Doyle deserved better. The system that took 4 years of her life called itself a hospital. She called it something else. We don't know exactly what. Her letters didn't all survive. This is dark Canada, where the ticket gets examined and the system that issued it finally gets named. Subscribe, because the buildings are still standing, and the names of the people inside them are still in the files. And we are not finished reading.